Hey y'all, I have two viewer submitted encounters again today. Strangely enough, both of these encounters are submitted by men who would later in life go on to be Army Rangers. I thought both of these were interesting, especially coming from guys at this time in their lives looking back on experiences they had before they became Rangers and how they kind of assessed this. And normally somebody would look back after a experience, being in the military and look back on it with more rational thought. And these guys both stand by their stories, and I believe them. So stand by. Here we go. I watch your YouTube channel, and I thought this would be a great place to share my two encounter. These are two encounters, one when I was 12 years old and the other when I was 15. I am 42 now. I'm a disabled vet. The area that I grew up in was a small town called Kapowson in Washington State, just outside of Eatonville. This area is heavily wooded and most of the industry is logging. There's a lake that I live close to called Kapowson Lake along an old railroad track system. We would go about a mile down the tracks, and the lake was on the left, and there was a mud flat on the right where nothing grew. My best friend and myself decided we would go camping to go fishing early in the morning, and the mud flat is where we set up our camp. I want you to understand that I knew these woods and the wildlife as I hunted and fished this area with my dad and my uncles since I was about 6. I also hunted herbs and fruit with my mother when I was even younger. We were not rich people, so this was used to keep food on the table. So even at 12, I was a fair to great woodsman, as most kids were that grew up in this town. Me and a friend set up our tent and built a rock circle for a fire and hung our cooler up in a tree. We went fishing until it got dark and came back to camp. We started a fire and cooked a few of the fish we had caught. As it was early spring, mid-April, just after my 12th birthday, it got chilly, so we went to bed shortly after dark. Sometime later, I woke up and had to get up and go pee. I got out of the tent and went over to a tree about 25 feet from camp. As I was finishing up, I noticed someone looking at me across the mud flat about 30 feet away. It was light enough for me to see fairly well, as the moon was up and the sky was clear, a rare thing in that area. And what was watching me was a female Bigfoot. I know she saw me as she watched me move and followed me with her head. She had to be at least 7.5 feet tall. I may have stood up to where her belly button would be if she had one. I could tell she was not looking to cause problems. She seemed to be interested in what I was or who I was. I was scared out of my skin, but my best friend was in the tent, sound asleep, and the tent was only about 10 feet from her. So I slowly went back to the tent and went in to wake up my friend as quietly as I could. I told him that Bigfoot was outside, and he didn't believe me until he stuck his head out and was looking at her, and he froze. We put on our clothes as fast as we could and ran down to the tracks as fast as we could, leaving everything behind. We got to my house around 3 a.m. It takes about 45 minutes to walk there, and it was a lot less than that to get home. And ended up with my mom and dad awake as we were both in a panic and made a lot of noise getting into the house. We told my mom and dad. My dad didn't believe me, but my mom said that many of my uncles said there were Bigfoot out there, and she seemed to believe us. The next morning, Mom went with us boys as we would not go alone, and we demanded that she bring a rifle just in case. We went back to the campsite and got our gear. Nothing was around, so we packed up fast, and then I brought Mom over to where the female Bigfoot was, and we found very clear tracks. I even tracked her a few feet into the woods. She had taken our fish on a live line kept at the lake, and there were tracks there too. This spooked my mom too, so we got out of there. The rest of that year, I did not go into that area on the lake to go fishing, and did not go there actually for the next 2 years. This got me to looking this stuff up, and I learned how to make track casts, and I learned that the area was well known for this happening often, and even the natives talked about the big man that lived in the forest. If you fast forward a couple of years and going back to the lake, me and one of my cousins decided to spend the weekend on the island using a small canoe with fishing gear and a deer rifle. By the way, I would not ever go into those woods without at least a compound bow or a rifle after the first time I saw Bigfoot. So we made camp and we were catching fish like crazy and made a fire and made up a few of the fish and some beans. Before we went to bed, we put our cooler in the canoe and tied it off and pushed it out into the water to keep the critters out of our food. We went to bed, and in the middle of the night, we heard a bunch of noise just outside of the tent and smelled this horrid smell. It smelled like a wet dog that had rolled in sewage, and we stuck our heads out with a 30-06 leading the way. We didn't see anything, but something had moved our canoe. We pushed it back out into the water and went back to sleep. The next morning, we went looking for tracks and didn't find much because it had rained hard just the day before. The next morning, we went looking for tracks and didn't find much as it had rained hard just before daylight and the underbrush was very thick. We decided to look further out as there were better ground 40 or feet or so away from the camp, and that's when we saw him. He just stepped into the woods out of that clearing, so we tracked him having both a high-powered rifle and my compound bow with us. We followed him to the log bridge, just an old-growth tree that fell over, making a bridge to the mainland from the island. And that's when we got the best view. He was on a log just over midway past the middle, heading to the land. He jumped off and ran through the clear-cut area into the woods. My cousin just couldn't believe it, and we watched him leave in a fast manner. We had about 50 foot of clear area, and we could see him very well. My cousin demanded that we leave. We were to spend the whole weekend there, and this was Saturday morning, but we went ahead and left early. We got home and told our parents. Mom knew I wouldn't make this stuff up, so she called my uncle. He was about as close to a mountain man as you could get in modern times, and I got him to help track this Bigfoot. We were both armed and we tracked it from our camp across the island to the clear cut and into the woods for about 3 miles. My uncle figured that it was long gone and we went home. After these sightings, I did not tell many people as my dad thought I was full of it and I did not want to be ridiculed. My closest friends have been told this story and of course my family. I'm not a very good writer, and English is not my first language, but I hope you can fully understand my email. And he signs off a disabled U.S. Army Ranger and jungle warfare specialist. Anyway, yes, sir, I understood the email very good, and that's a pretty common encounter story. I think people see these things out in the woods, and if they're not up on Bigfoot or they haven't read any other encounters, they really don't know what it is. But if there's information out there they've come across, they know exactly what it is, and I think this is the case with you. So thank you very much for sending in the story. Okay, so here's our second encounter story submitted by a man who would later in life become a ranger, and he writes, "This encounter took place in the Homachito National Forest in southwest Mississippi. I do not wish my name to be shared, but the location is fine. I served 5 years in the Army as a ranger and infantryman. I have been across the world and seen a lot, but nothing like what I'm about to tell you. I am an avid outdoorsman, and I spend a lot of time in the woods. Also, to let you know that I'm well versed in wildlife and nature. Thanks for letting me share this with you, and God bless." In the late fall, early winter of 1981, the day before Thanksgiving, is when this incident took place. Deer season had opened, and I looked forward to deer hunting at every opportunity. I was out of school for the Thanksgiving break and putting together plans to be able to hunt as much as possible. This was a daunting task as I was too young to drive and had to get with some friends in order to go. 2 days before Thanksgiving, 2 of my older brother's friends dropped by my house and they were hanging out. They invited my brother to go hunting, but he couldn't go because of work, so they invited me. I was excited beyond belief that they were going to let me go. I was up at 3:30 a.m. the next morning and looking out the front door, waiting anxiously. At around 4 a.m., as promised, the men drove up. I loaded up and we were on the way. It took probably 45 minutes to arrive at the location. The place we parked was a washed-out, low-water bridge. Roy, the man driving, had a four-wheel drive, but the washout was too much for it. Roy and Donnie had gotten permission from the landowner, who owned a couple of 100 acres, to park there and travel by foot on across his property to some national forest land on the backside of his place. They had hunted back there several times before and had a good relationship with the owner. We grabbed our things and began the walk. I had no idea how far it would be, nor where we would actually be hunting. It was extremely cold that morning, and the light wind cut through me as we followed the old logging road. Finally, Donnie stopped and told me how to get to the place where he wanted me to hunt. He told me he would meet me back at this spot at 9:30. I nodded and continued on. I came to an open food plot that was described to me and stopped for a minute at the edge. It was still well before daylight, and I decided to turn off my flashlight to proceed across the field. I wanted to do my best to keep from spooking any deer that may have been in there feeding. I got to the middle of the field, and a feeling of being watched came over me. I stopped and stood there for a couple of minutes, but the feeling didn't go away. I turned on my light and scanned the field, but I saw and heard nothing. The wind had died down, and there was absolutely dead calm. It was as quiet as a church. I overcame my nervousness and continued on and reached the far side of the woodline. The sky had started showing pink in the horizon, and the gray hue of dawn was lingering. I eased on a pretty good ways and found a low spot that was dry but could tell it normally held water. It was light enough to see 30 or 40 yards by now. I noticed several scrapes and rubs that were fresh littered about. I knew a buck or several bucks must be traveling through here. I was excited, to say the least. There was frost on the ground that morning, and I need to mention that it was near impossible to walk through the oak leaf litter that covered the ground without making noise. The dry leaves, along with the frost on top of them, made you sound like a small vehicle moving through them, even walking slow and taking your time. I found a white oak tree that was wider than my shoulder width, scratched all the leaves away so I could sit down and shift around without making noise. I leaned back and got comfortable and settled in to wait. I scanned the woods and nothing really happened until around 8 a.m. I had noticed that it was really still that morning and also had not seen any wildlife. No squirrels, no birds, nothing. That in itself was very unusual. I caught movement about 70 or so yards away up one of the little finger ridges and finally made out a deer slipping down towards the bottom. I then made out the white-tipped horns of a nice buck. He continued slowly along and stopped cold in his tracks, still out of range of my shotgun. My heart skipped a beat as the deer stood motionless, looking in my direction for what seemed like several minutes. He never turned and ran, and he eased backwards without looking away from my direction. I had never seen a deer walk backwards in that manner before or since this event. He took 5 or 6 steps back and in a blink whirled and left like he was shot out of a cannon. I sat there in disbelief, trying to figure out what had happened. I had not so much as blinked, so I know he never saw me. A slight breeze could be felt on my left cheek, and that told me that he could not have winded me. I had begun shaking from the adrenaline and the cold a little. I was sitting there trying to figure out what had just happened. That's when I heard the first breathing sound. It was barely audible at first, but began to increase in volume. At first, I thought it was me due to the excitement. I held my breath, but the sound did not stop. By now, it was very loud and very close. It was heavy and raspy. I slowly looked around as far as I could to my left, but the tree was too wide for me to see around. I then looked down and saw my shadow, the tree shadow, and a third massive shadow standing behind the tree. I jumped to my feet and away from the tree, and there before me was a hair-covered, upright creature. He stood 7 to 7.5 feet tall and was covered with pine straw-colored hair that was 5 to 6 inches long. He was slender and not very bulky. The only part of his body that had no hair was his face. It was flat for the most part, and he had no neck from what I could see. His forehead was large, and his eyes were set back. I saw no white in them, just coal black. His nose turned up slightly and was not large either. He showed no teeth, and his mouth was very wide, with thin lips. His skin was gray in color, and you could actually see it through his hair. His arms hung straight down by his side and appeared extremely long, hanging below his knees by several inches. His hands had hair on the backside, but his inside part of his hands were grayish also. His fingers appeared to be very long and looked like discolored fingernails, not claws. He had a slight, stooped forward posture. I was scared beyond belief. I wanted to run, but the creature was between me and where I wanted to go. I still cannot believe this to this day, why I did not shoot him at point blank range. The thought never crossed my mind. I dropped my gun and ran as fast as I could, swinging wide away from him. Thinking back, he could have caught me easily, I'm sure. He never made a sound and never posed a threat the whole time. I think back how I never heard that thing moving through the leaf litter, how stealthy it was. Had I not heard the breathing, I would have never heard him at all. I hit the clearing in full gait, shouting and calling for Donnie the whole way. He appeared and was afraid something had happened to me. He grabbed me and I tried to recount the story. He did not believe me at first, and I can understand that. We walked in silence back out and called for Roy where we had parted earlier. Finally, Roy appeared. After telling him what had happened, he came to the conclusion that I had seen a bear. I told him that was no bear. He noticed I did not have my gun. When I told him where I dropped it, he said, "We need to go get it." I thought going back to sitting and my gun was where I had dropped it. While I was getting it, they looked down at the ground where I told them the thing was standing. Pressed down in the leaves, you could plainly see the impressions where it had been standing. He could also see that the creature turned and walked towards the creek. I did not want to, but the men insisted, following the tracks for a bit. We made it to the creek bank, and it was a steep drop-off, 6 or 8 feet. We could see where something slid down, and then we saw very good tracks in the sand where the thing had crossed. The tracks were 15 to 16 inches long and about 8 inches wide. It had 3 toes, not 5. We saw 4 good tracks, and they were about 4 feet in stride. Roy and Donnie both said, "Let's get out of here." There was very little said on the walk out and complete silence on the ride home. We never spoke about it again, and I have never returned there to this day. Donnie is no longer living, and Roy moved away, and I have not spoken to him in 20 years. This story is 100% true, and I have only told a few people about this. I know most people will call it mistaken identity or say that I made this up, but I know what I saw that day, and all I can tell you is these things are 100% real.